Hello everybody, welcome back to Chess for Non-Chess Players. In this video, what I would like to go over is what is chess? What's going on? What's happening? And to start answering that question, I kind of want to start with what are some misconceptions? Um, a lot of times when people talk about chess, they're talking about strategy, like some sort of grand strategic, you know, I know 10 moves ahead what this person is going to do. And they don't know that I know that in 5 moves they're going to play X, Y, or Z. And although that's the general, perception of chess, that's not at all what's happening. The better analogy to me would be like real life. Generally, you're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to go to work, you're going to come home, you're going to eat dinner, you're going to go to bed. You're going to do these things on this routine. And, generally, you're probably going to do those things. But what your day actually looks like is very different. When you go to work, you may think you're working on one thing, and then suddenly you have to work on another thing. Or maybe the place you get lunch at is closed and you have to go to another place for lunch. Or, there's little deviations from your day to day activities that really define your day more than what you thought you were going to do when you woke up. And chess is very much like that. I have no idea what my opponent's going to play. And one of the other funny misconceptions I always get is people saying, well, if I, as in me, if I don't know what they're going to do, then, it will throw me off or something like that. And kind of back to my point, no. Actually, it's kind of the opposite because chess is not really a game of strategy in many respects that you might initially think it is. Rather, it's a game of adaptation and adaptation over learned experience, much like real life. And so even though, the goal of the game obviously is checkmate, the road to that is extremely complicated because I have no idea what my opponent is going to do. So that makes things very interesting. So when we think about how chess works, we really can divide it into three distinct phases of the game. You have your opening, you have your middle game, and you have your end game. And these are terminologies you've probably heard before. But each of those different phases have different objectives. And they have different objectives because in order to go from point A to point B to point C to point D, we have to be doing different things to change the board state. So in the opening, right, you may have heard that terminology. There are some famous opening names you may have heard, like the Queen's Gambit, like the TV show, or the Sicilian defense, or the Scandinavian defense. These are all different types of ways of configuring your pieces at the beginning of the game, but in general, the opening can be summarized by you're getting everybody doing something, and you're doing so in a way that puts you in an advantageous position in a very complicated game of King of the Hill. Now, what do I mean by King of the Hill? Well, there are 4 squares on the board that we consider to be our center squares. These 4: the d5 square, the e5 square, the d4 square, and the e4 square. And if saying those names of the squares sounded like hieroglyphics, it's because of a thing called chess notation, which is how we speak and write about the game. But for now, we're just going to talk about these as just the center squares. And in the beginning of the game, our goal really is to control these center 4 squares. And the reason why is because if you think about where your pieces might have the most mobility, or where you might have a better control over the board. If you control the middle, you have a lot more options than if you were to control like the sides. And so, just like in real life, the more, center control you have, the better vantage point you have, the more control you have over the surroundings. And so, what we do in the beginning of a chess game is we focus purely and solely on trying to control the center of the board in some capacity, while also getting all of our pieces doing something in that process. And I'm going to make some moves. You don't have to understand why I'm making these moves, but just to illustrate, what I am doing here is I am moving pieces such that they control the center of the board. Just as part of my key objective in the beginning of the game is moving a piece every single turn and making sure that these pieces are doing something important. Now, when I say piece, as a non-chess player, you might be thinking that everything that we have is a piece, but that's not true. Usually when chess players are talking about pieces, they're talking about the bishops, the knights, the rooks, the kings, and the queens, and not the pawns. Pawns usually just being referred to as pawns. But now we are in a thing called a middle game. Once we have all of our pieces doing something, we are in what we call a middle game. And this obviously looks very complicated. There are lots of pieces in various places, lots of pawns have moved in various places. And again, there's no grand strategy here. The whole purpose of the beginning of the game is simply, how do I put my pieces in such a position that they are doing something at the very least, hopefully something effective. And now that we are in the middle of the game, what's called the middle game, basically our goal is using the result of the opening. How do we create a problem that we know we can solve? Think of it sort of like a math problem. Like, when you may have taken some advanced math courses or something in your life, or algebra even, there are situations where you have some really, really messy mathematical thing that you have to solve, and at first glance, you don't know instantly how you're going to solve it. And so what do we do when we have a math problem that we don't know how to solve? Well, what we do is we break it up into simpler problems that we know how to solve, and hopefully end up in a situation where we have a simple problem at the end that we already have experience solving. And we do the same thing in chess. We try to take what's in front of us and turn it into something simpler that we can solve. And obviously, that portion of chess is where a lot of the creativity and a lot of the craziness comes from. But the whole purpose of the middle of the game, again, not doing anything super abstract, knowing 50 moves ahead type thing, just simply, how do we slowly, one move at a time, turn this big mess in front of us into something that we know how to solve? And then that brings us to the last section, which is the end game, which is when all the pieces go away, how do we solve the problem in front of us to bring either a win, a draw, or a loss? And I will be going into more depth into each of these phases in their own separate video, and certain little intricacies of them, again, at a level that's digestible and understandable. But at a very, very high level, all we are doing when we are playing a game of chess is we are making all of our pieces do something effective, reconfiguring them in a way that we feel is advantageous for us, and then solving a problem that we know how to solve. and attempting to get to that point. And if we can do that more effectively than our opponent, then we are going to win. And that also means that, and where some of the beauty of this game comes from, is that our opponent is trying to do the same thing at the same time. And so us pushing our objectives and our opponents pushing their objectives, when we need to know as players when to pivot from what we are doing to something else, when we need to do things to stop our opponent rather than advancing our own plan, or when we need to accurately solve the problem in front of us. These are a lot of the challenges that chess players face in everyday games. So thank you for watching, and we'll be going into a little bit further depth in future videos on each of these. But at a glance, generally speaking, whether we're talking about beginner games, intermediate games, grandmaster games, everybody is generally following these basic phases, and every game is going through each of these phases in a different, unique way every single time. Thank you very much.